Mike Gonzalez is joining me today. He is a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and author of BLM, The Making of a New Marxist Revolution, which will be released on September 7th. Mike, thank you so much for joining me today.
Samantha, thank you very much for having me, and I'm very proud of your success as a journalist.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And something that we are talking about today is actually something that's very near and dear to your heart, and that is Cuba. You actually left Cuba when you were 12 years old, and you went to Europe for 2 years, and then you came to the United States when you were 14 years old. Now, something that's been going on just over the last week is unrest. There's been protests going on, and I want to start with how the Biden administration has been responding to this unrest. Now, on Wednesday, the White House press secretary Jen Psaki was asked,
"Do you think that people are leaving Cuba because they don't like communism?"
I think we've been pretty clear that we think people are leaving Cuba, or not leaving Cuba, or protesting in the streets as well, because they are opposed to the oppression, to the mismanagement of the government in the country. And we certainly support their right to protest. We support their efforts to speak out.
And then on Thursday, she was asked again,
does this White House still think the protests in Cuba are happening because people are upset about a rise in COVID cases there, or is there some thought maybe given to the possibility that they are protesting because they are sick of communism?
Well, Peter, first I would say communism is a failed ideology, and we certainly believe that. It has failed the people of Cuba. They deserve freedom. They deserve a government that supports them, whether that is making sure they have health and medical supplies, access to vaccines, or whether they have economic opportunity and prosperity.
I want to just get your reaction to and compare the two answers that Jen Psaki had between Wednesday and Thursday. And do you think that there was a change in her stance on why people were protesting?
Yeah, it's been very hard. It's been like extracting teeth to get them to oppose communism, but they're finally coming around. President Biden, I'm happy to note, did come out with a statement against communism towards the end of the week, saying that communism had failed everywhere it had been tried, and he said socialism was not his idea of a replacement, but he seemed to want to get off the stage at that point. He said, "But that's another story. That's another conversation." He didn't seem to want to pick a fight with socialism as much, which is very telling. Obviously, he's looking at the left flank of his party. The Democratic Socialists of America came out with a statement supporting the brutal communist dictatorship in Cuba. So did Black Lives Matter, came out with a statement supporting, even though it's very clear what these communist thugs are doing in the streets of Havana and other Cuban cities, persecuting, rounding up anyone who dare protest, and locking them up. The administration seems to be very skittish about denouncing Marxism, but it is finally doing it, and we should all in America, all of us should say that this is a good thing, that it is finally happening, although it needs to be much more forthright.
Absolutely. And you just brought up the Black Lives Matter statement and their organization coming out and calling this U.S. embargo on Cuba a, quote, cruel and inhumane policy. They called on President Biden to lift that embargo, which they labeled as a blatant human rights violation. I want to ask first, why was this embargo put on in the first place? And do you think that it should be lifted? If it is, what message does that send? And if it isn't, what message does that send then?
Well, Black Lives Matter did much more than that. Black Lives Matter actually defended the communist government, said that it had made advances in health, and that it had supported Africans in their search for liberty. None of that is true. In fact, the majority of the population of Cuba today is majority African descent to one degree or another, and the communist leadership, starting with the Castro family and Miguel Diaz-Canel, happened to be white. They're descendants of Spaniards. So Black Lives Matter, is really missing a beat here. The reason to support the communist dictatorship, it has nothing to do with color or race, is because they're dogmatic, they're Marxist, just like the communist government is Marxist. The sanctions that were put in place, starting with Kennedy, were put in place because of that, because the communist government is repressive, has not held elections ever in 62 years, does not does not allow the most basic natural rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of movement. So they, they were, a lot of them were lifted under Obama, and Obama, for some reason, did not demand anything in return, and got nothing in return. Cubans got nothing as a result of the lifting of many sanctions. Obama established diplomatic relations for the first time in over 5 decades, and there were no concessions made by the communists. In fact, the repression against Cubans became worse. I think President Trump was very smart to come in and reinstate some of the sanctions, especially the sanctions against remittances. Remittances are a very bad thing for the receiving population and for the sending population. The sending population should be building human and social capital and plain old financial capital. And instead of doing that, they're sending money to their relatives. It's not good for them, not good for anybody. And I can say this about El Salvador and any other country as well. So I think that by the way, I don't see Biden now lifting these sanctions. It's not politically feasible for him. It would be a very bad look for him to throw the communists in Cuba a lifeline now by lifting sanctions. I tweeted at Representative Ocasio-Cortez, who is a democratic socialist. Let's not forget, democratic socialist, once again, came out with a statement supporting the communist repressive regime. Ocasio-Cortez had a statement also talking about the sanctions. I asked her, I believe she speaks Spanish. I asked her if she had heard a single pro-democracy demonstrator in Cuba demanding the lifting of sanctions. I'm pretty sure she hasn't, because none had called for that. They had called for freedom. They have called for democracy. They had called for the end of economic mismanagement, i.e., for the end of communism.
Do you think that will happen? Do you think there will be an end to communism? I mean, where does this end, I guess, for these protesters?
Well, right now it's ending very badly, and which reminds us again of their courage. They knew it was going to be turn out very badly for them. They knew that they were going to be rounded up and beaten up and shot, etc., and that is happening. The only way out that I see, short of the international community finally having a consensus that 62 years of oppression in Cuba is quite enough, is for the Cuban military to refuse to shoot on its own people, the way we saw the Philippine military do in the mid-'80s when Fidel Ramos refused to support the dictator Ferdinand Marcos and sided with his people. If we see enough Cuban generals siding with their people, instead of shooting at them or beating them up or rounding them up, there's a chance that this ends well for the Cubans. But I don't see the Castro family contributing to a peaceful transition. They know what would happen to them in a democratic Cuba, and they don't want to abandon their wealth and their comfort.
Now, the Biden administration has been called on by people across the United States. I believe there was a rally or protest yesterday in front of the White House in support of the protesters in Cuba. I know in Miami there were protests going on. What do you think the Biden administration can do to support these protesters in Cuba? And, in terms of the future of relations between the United States and Cuba, what does that look like?
Well, first of all, with the last one, Biden really cannot lift any of the sanctions. He should strengthen the sanctions. It should be clear to him. Biden is not a communist. Biden is not a socialist. He might be afraid of socialists in his party, but he is not one himself. It should be clear to him that now it's not the time to lift sanctions. It should be also clear to him that now it's a time to support the cry for freedom on the island, and that anything that he can do, that the U.S. government can do to make sure that the communists do not limit internet use in Cuba, do not establish an internet blackout. We should do all we can technologically to let the 11 million Cubans talk among themselves, let each other know what they're doing, organize protests by use of social media and the internet. So we can do this technologically. Biden should be looking into this.
Mike, I really appreciate you coming on to talk about this. As I mentioned earlier, your family is from Cuba and you fled Cuba when you were just 12 years old. I just really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story, sharing your message about Cuba and what we can expect moving forward with United States relations with them. So thank you so much. Again, your book, which is coming out in September, BLM, The Making of a Marxist Revolution. Thank you so much.
It's on Amazon, BLM, The Making of a New Marxist Revolution. I must say, Samantha, before I get off stage, the best thing we can do to help the Cubans or anybody else is by remaining free ourselves. We must fight Marxism right here.